Hello, everyone. Welcome to Ask Professor, a UWM web series where we ask professors questions about everything. My name is Pete Geraci. I am a professional archaeologist and academic assistant for UWM Department of Anthropology. I will be your host, and today we are asking Professor Thomas Malaby about the unusual story of how a community of investors in an online subreddit sparked a buying frenzy of GameStop in late January. The unlikely jump in stock prices created enormous wealth for some unlikely Wall Street heroes, while leaving others profoundly confused and in the red. Hi, Thomas. Thank you for being here.
Very glad to be here, Pete.
Well, I am so excited to have you on as our very first guest of Ask a Professor.
Me too.
Okay, to give a little background on the issue, in January, a community of investors organized online in an online subreddit called Wall Street Bets. A number of influencers notified their peers they were going to invest heavily into GameStop. As cohorts jumped on the bandwagon, they've effectively executed what investors call a short squeeze, putting short sellers in a huge bind. The squeeze took several days to unfold. According to an NBC News story, GME on January 7th was $18. Then it doubled in 4 days. It kept shooting higher before nearly doubling on Tuesday, and then more than doubling again until hitting an astronomical $347.51 on Wednesday, January 24th, after Elon Musk tweeted "Game Stonk." This further tightened the squeeze and also put a young trading app, Robinhood, in a serious cash flow problem. Unsure what to do, they began to limit the trading of GME on their app. This raised eyebrows everywhere from Wall Street to the new administration. Now, some might say this isn't your typical anthropological topic, but my guest Thomas Malaby has some very unique insight into these events. Professor Malaby is currently chair and professor of anthropology at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. His research interest is in the ever-changing relationships among institutions, unpredictability, and technology, especially as they are realized through games and game-like processes. He has published numerous and widely cited works on the status of games in human experience. Dr. Malaby's work suggests that the increasing use of digital games by institutions marks a fundamental transition in modern governance. His most recent book, Making Virtual Worlds, Linden Lab and Second Life, is an ethnographic examination of a San Francisco high-tech firm. Thomas, please help us understand what happened with GameStop. Is this just some kids breaking the stock market, or is there something more to what happened at the end of January?
Well, with something this dramatic that is this high stakes, maybe we shouldn't be too surprised that my answer is that there's something more to this than a one-off kind of event. Before I get into some of the details of my perspective on it, and thank you for the nice introduction, but I do want to emphasize that I don't study the stock market and I don't study the technicalities of this kind of trade, of short sales and the rest. There are some wonderful articles out there where people have covered it, and I understand that you'll be linking a number of resources for our viewers. What I have studied is online communities, how online communities are architected by companies like Facebook or Linden Lab or Reddit and all the rest. And also I've looked very carefully at the idea of the market as a kind of game, a competitive game, and how that, looking at the way we understand the market in those terms, perhaps can help us understand a bit more about what's going on with the GameStop phenomenon.
Okay.
The other thing that we want to keep in mind for understanding this kind of event is the role of norms in it, the role of culture in it. We've had many more chances to talk about norms in recent years. What norms do, what role they play, right, in the institutions that we have. While for some time there might have been a general assumption that norms are less important or less decisive than things like contracts and laws and hard structures of those sorts. I think we've been reminded, forcibly, of something that James Madison, one of our founding fathers, knew, which is that the system doesn't work if people decide not to follow certain kinds of norms.
Right.
So when we think about norms and the stock market and we think about games, we notice a few interesting things all come together. For one thing, the market has for a very long time been presented in American culture and beyond American culture as something that operates like a game and like a competitive game,
Hmm.
an individual competitive game, a zero sum game, in fact, where the actors participate most efficiently and most effectively to the extent that they simply pursue rationally their own interests without any regard for other people's interests. That has been the framing of how the market works for a long time as a kind of game and an individualized competitive game at that. But of course, anyone who spends time in an actual business, especially something like a small business, knows that it's not that simple. Norms are extremely important. The relationships you have are extremely important, right? In order to run a successful business, often you have to build those relationships. You have to consider giving a favor to someone, and that may be because you have to ask a favor of them on another occasion, right? So
Right. Right.
as we think about this strange way in which the market has been thought of as uh, a game that to which norms don't apply, and then we look at the GameStop phenomenon, uh, what we realize is that from the point of view of Redditors, people on the subreddit, uh, looking to pursue this about GameStop, perhaps about some other companies, there is on the one hand a kind of game-like approach in evidence. Hey, we can do this. This is not against any rules. We
Hmm.
can pursue it, right?
Hmm.
And we can sort of, doesn't matter what the interests of short sellers might be, we can just go ahead and do this. So the
Right.
game-like idea about it is underwriting and legitimizing to them what they're doing.
So
And
do you
it's
think so sorry to interrupt, but do you think that these folks on Reddit are thinking in game-like terms, or are they just acting in game-like terms?
I think it's always both. I think that when we approach any aspect of our lives, our job, uh, our relationships with others, our interests, we're regularly coming to that with we're working from some kind of model about how to do that. What our ethics that we bring to bear on how we behave in that environment are going to be informed by models like, is this a game? Is this a zero sum situation?
Hmm.
Is any gain on my part a loss on someone else's part? We may not sort of say to ourselves, I look at my participation in this college class as a game. Uh, the more I win is dependent upon other students losing, right?
Hmm.
But it certainly happens. And I found it to be extremely effective, just as an aside, to tell students in my classes, especially small scale classes where there's a lot of discussion, to tell those students right at the outset, this is not a zero sum circumstance. If you're talking, it's not because it doesn't mean you're scoring points and at the expense of other students. And if someone else is talking, they're not scoring points at the expense of you, right?
Right.
You have
Right.
to say that because they come to that kind of, they, not all the students, but some of the students will come to that circumstance thinking of it in individually competitive game like terms.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah. So when it comes to this situation, we have this kind of norm breaking going on, actually, right? And I don't mean to say that the redditors don't have their own ethics also on the scene, their own ideologies, perhaps political ideologies shaping what they're doing, but they're pursuing what they can do in part because under the justification that the market allows us to do this, right?
Right.
And the short sellers, of course, find this highly disruptive and transgressive and are aghast at it. But they can only be aghast about it because norms have been violated, because
Right.
no one's done anything illegal,
Right.
right? So I find that fascinating because it means these multi-billion-dollar hedge fund investors are used to operating in an environment that they might call a market, and they might call it a free market, and they might, in one circumstance or another, lobby very hard and often effectively for no regulation of what they do, under the claim that this is a free and open, zero-sum and competitive environment. That's what it's all about. You've got to let us do this, right?
Right.
In fact, they actually follow norms when they participate in that market. And they tend to be norms that make sure that they and their class of colleagues have shared interests that are supported, right?
Right.
So all along, they were relying on certain norms to make this short selling work for them, including the norm of not disclosing what your short positions are, right?
Uh-huh.
Ironies of this is that the person who lost the most money is someone who was trying to be transparent about their short selling positions, right? But they have been comfortable occupying a position insured by the following of certain norms to accumulate capital within a market financial landscape that could have been disrupted and what.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Uh, to me, one of the great lessons of that it is one that mirrors the story of Archer Daniels Midland. If anyone has listened to the wonderful This American Life podcast about it, or broadcast at the time, or seen the film The Informant, which is based on this story, you have this incredible circumstance at Archer Daniels Midland. I think it was the late 90s, where they were at this incredibly powerful company with about 5 other competitors around the world, all non-US companies. And they were fixing the prices of certain resources. I think it was lysine or something like that. They would get together once a year, always outside the United States, and
Uh-huh.
fix prices, right? That was their norm. They were following their norms to fix those prices outside of the market in a kind of extra market maneuver, right? Why were they doing that? Well, they were doing that because to follow those norms meant that they were going to be in a position to preserve their status on top of the market, right? The
Right.
market at a certain point becomes a threat to them. It's too volatile. They don't want
Right.
volatility. They want
Right.
fixed
Right.
prices, and all their competitors do too, right? So that is what oligarchy is driven by, right? Is this decision that actually that game-like freewheeling quality of the market, that's not what we want. We want, if we can just employ some norm-driven behavior here, we can all make a lot of money.
Right.
So I see something similar as the lesson of the GameStop phenomenon. You've got a culture around Wall Street that supports a certain kind of behavior of short selling and massive profit, right? That was driven as much by norms as by anything else. It was not a kind of free and open landscape of people pursuing their own individual interests entirely. The Redditors come along and completely disrupt that. Just like people disrupting a game within the rules, right? By
Right.
playing it a different way. Like
That
Dr. J or Oscar Robertson taking basketball above the rim in the 70s.
right. You know what it kind of reminds me of is when a bunch of folks organize on a massive online game like Warcraft or something like that and decide, hey, this guy's coming in, he's got all the best weapons and armor and stuff, and he's killing all of us. Let's band together and take him down so that we can get back to a normal life in a game.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And on EVE Online, there have been incredible examples of this, massive, this interstellar, huge virtual world all in one server, and you have thousands and thousands of players, and you have, some corporation in that world, the fact that it's a capitalist structure, it makes it a very apt analogy. You get one group that becomes too powerful and a bunch of other ones band together to take them down, right? It's that
Right.
mentality, very
And
simple.
it's not so much that the market is free, it's more of like it has this impression that it's free. And there's so many, there's lots of regulations, and then there are people going around those regulations, and they're not punished for it.
That's
And in
right.
fact, they're lauded for it sometimes. And the investors, they'll they'll short sell, they'll bump up the price of a stock, and if they get caught, so what? They have to pay $1 million fine, and then they just go on with their lives with their other $100 million. So
Right.
there really isn't any there's no competitive force here, it seems, except for now apparently these folks that are organizing on Reddit and other places that are saying, hey, we realize that these people have an inordinate amount of power, and we're going to try and take some of that power back, or at least play them at their own game.
Right. Right. Although interestingly enough, playing them at their own game kind of within the, quote unquote, legitimate rules of it rather than the often illegitimate other norm driven kind of exploitation of loopholes and the like, right? You mentioned several. We could add to them things like insider trading, trading based on the sharing of information that's supposed to be tightly regulated, but norms. The norms of people in the financial sector often mean, well, a lot of that's overlooked, and we can just look the other way, and it's
Well,
okay.
yeah, especially when elected officials can get away with it.
Right, right. Which there's been some concerns about lately. So the myth of the unregulated market is a long-standing myth. It's easy to demonstrate as false, but what's more interesting about it is that it's one way of talking about this picture of the market as this Wild West, rugged individualist space in which everyone is just out for themselves, and no one has to worry about corruption or double dealing or insider trading, because the kind of story goes, since everyone's just pursuing their own interest, no one would collude, or no one would engage in monopolistic practices and all the rest. But of course, it's not true. It's demonstrated time and time again. So the market is always governed by both law on the one hand and norms on the other, both of which get in the way of any picture of it as a utterly free Wild West kind of environment.
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, the stock market is not necessarily what people would think when you think of cultural anthropology or anthropology in general, and that kind of seems to be a norm almost. When you talk to regular people about anthropology, they immediately think of people in the jungle who haven't seen contact with the modern world, or some other kind of fantastical idea of what anthropologists do. But in reality, anthropologists are thinking about very modern problems like online communities and Wall Street and those sorts of things. So if you were to recommend to students or to other researchers who are interested in this topic, what could they do? What kind of journals are there, or research books, that sort of thing?
Yeah, it's a fast growing area in anthropology. I do think there was some truth to the fact that anthropologists were a little slow out of the gate on technology, but we have been looking at large scale industrialized societies for some time. There was at a certain point, it became inevitable, even if there was a sort of thread within cultural anthropology of people who were attracted to the idea of going to the far-flung places. Eventually, we didn't have any more far-flung places. Globalization means that many of these processes are touching every single part of the world. But back to your question, well, one of the places I would point to is literature I was more involved with earlier in my career, but some of the very best ethnographies that we have are ethnographies of Europe, of different parts of Europe. You've got wonderful ethnographies about Britain and labor and class in Britain, such as Learning to Labor is a classic. You've got wonderful ethnographies about such as by Didier Fassin, about immigration in France. So there's incredible ethnographies about almost every major issue you could imagine in the European context. And similarly, in the United States, anthropologists have been writing about some of the most pressing issues and problems in the United States for some time. And some, at some points, we must admit, some of those ethnographies are not written strictly speaking by anthropologists, but it's by people near us in fields like sociology or geography who are
Hmm.
using ethnography extremely effectively to write about the topics of the present concern. So I'd list a few. Anthropologist Philippe Bourgois, Selling Crack in El Barrio, is a modern classic as well.
Uh-huh.
We have our own Paul Broadwin, whose book Everyday Ethics is quite an incredible book about the delivery of psychiatric services through community psychiatry. The list can go on and on. As far as non-anthropologists, Matthew Desmond has written Evicted, also about Milwaukee, MacArthur Genius Award winner, probably the best ethnography published that I've read of the last 20 years. Absolutely incredible. But for those interested in technology specifically, we have a number of great ethnographies that have come out. Again, a non-anthropologist, T.L. Taylor, has written quite a few books about different facets of technology and games, including a wonderful book called Watch Me Play, which is about Twitch. She also has a book about Play Between Worlds, which is about the EverQuest community. We have Tom Belstorff in anthropology, wrote a wonderful book about Second Life, which is a kind of a complement to my own book. We've got books about the high-tech scientific research, books such as Hugh Gusterson's about nuclear technology. There are so many, it's difficult for me to pick them out of my head, but they are out there, and they are really wonderful to encounter. Just for one kind of interesting example, Mary Gray's Out in the Country is a book about LGBTQ identifying young people in Appalachia, I believe West Virginia. And the interesting issue there is that these are scattered people in a relatively low population density part of the country who are desperate to find each other. They're desperate to find people just to connect with and to share experiences with and to get support from. So she explores how technology comes onto the scene as a way, in relatively new ways, digitally network technology enables people to connect who are otherwise isolated. So that's just a few examples.
Thank you for that. I knew that there was a lot of literature out there, but I feel like sometimes that is overshadowed or not spoken enough about in mainstream media, that anthropologists do work with these issues. And yes, other sociology, other disciplines take a lot from anthropology, especially in the ethnographic methods that we have developed in this discipline. Now, I do understand that you have started working with students on these issues and that you're in the process of developing a larger program and such, and that you have a digital cultures lab here at UW Milwaukee, and that you've been working with students, working with Twitch and other online platforms. Can you just explain that a little bit?
Yeah, thank you for asking about that. We have the most incredible group of graduate students here at UW Milwaukee. They come from a number of disciplines. I primarily work with those in both anthropology and English with my colleague Stuart Malthrop. Stuart Malthrop and I, our master's students and our PhD students, are involved in a digital cultures collaboratory that is supported through the Center for 21st Century Studies here at UWM. We have, although we haven't been able to use it for the past year under COVID, but we've made adjustments and we're doing it remotely. But we have a dedicated studio on campus for Twitch streaming with two different setups, one for playing digital games and another for playing tabletop games, primarily Dungeons and Dragons. We run 4 to 5 different shows every week. You can find them on Twitch as UWM Serious Play on Twitter. Please, anyone is invited to
We'll
come.
definitely add a link to the video for that.
Oh, great. And it's a place where we're working on our research interests through playing and talking about games. And sometimes designing and building games. We recently had where my PhD student incoming this fall, Matthew Karacher, was demoing his own thing that he's coded up for as a Dungeon Masters kind of database-driven assistance program. So we have just enormously talented students, very dedicated, who are producing a lot of content. They're producing blog posts, video blog posts, the ones by Eric Kirsting. He also posts them to YouTube under the name I Am Air. They are terrific little quick hits about games you love and why they're interesting. Tetris, you can find a bunch of there. And I should mention, this group is just one cluster of graduate students and within a broader set of graduate students in different areas, all interested in the digital dimensions of culture. So our new graduate certificate, which we hope to have online for this fall, allows our graduate students to pursue their research interests in these various clusters. Another one on campus under Chris Cantwell in history is about podcasting. We have a number of different public history projects. We have the Digital Humanities Lab on campus. The programming at the Center for 21st Century Studies is itself also committed to covering aspects of the digital and human experience. And our new certificate program is going to be a way in which graduate students across these areas, and any graduate student at UWM is eligible to apply to join the certificate, that those students can gain some credit for their practical experience in these digital skills that they're getting, as well as learn how to dive more deeply into understanding their implications.
Well, that sounds really fun. And I do want to end this interview soon, and I want to end it on kind of a funny note about all this. And I kind of wanted to get your impression about some of the funnier lingo that's been coming out of the online world, and like, for example, GameStonk, and stonks as stocks, and tendies as the currency in which these Redditors are exchanging themselves. So I have a couple of definitions here that I find really funny. So tendies are used to represent money, or these little digital points, or some kind of point system that kids typically work on. Like, hey, look, mom, I did something good. Can I get some tendies? So chicken tenders, they're, as everyone knows, they're breaded chicken strips, right? And in some specifically, it plays on this idea that, these neckbeards, these online warriors, are maladjusted man children, and chicken nuggets are considered kids' food. So this was popularized on 4chan, actually. And just, they're good boy points, essentially. And right. I find that really hilarious, just because, in anthropology, linguistics is a big component, and words mean things, and the creation of words in these online communities is so fascinating to me. So I just want, just get your little input on all the different lingo that's coming out and all that.
Absolutely. Well, I'm not a linguistic anthropologist. I'm kind of very near to being one. I work a lot with language in my work and teach quite a bit about the anthropology of especially linguistic performance, right? What does it mean? Exactly the sort of stuff you're talking about. What does it mean when people use a different word for something or change the meaning of something? What is going on in that kind of behavior? And, I'll give just a short little set of comments about that. As you say, you're wrapping up, but I think it's interesting to look at any community that develops, there's the word esoteric, right? Esoteric means, inside, to an in-group. Any group that develops esoteric language, especially for familiar and everyday things, it's a marker of distinction. It's one way to mark membership in that group. And you mentioned stonks and tendies, right? Of course, you have also a bunch of layers of linguistic interest in there, right? Because chicken tenders is one set of associations that make that an attractive abbreviation. But the other is the idea of legal tender, right? So they kind of come together with this, there's a kind of what we call, when we look at, what's called the kind of poetics of language, the creative use of language, that kind of double meaning is extra potent, right?
Right.
And more likely picked up. But we should see these kinds of specialized or developing new terminologies in relation to other familiar ones, like doggo for dog or bird for bird, and all goes on and on. It's a community finding ways to distinguish itself, to mark their intimacy with each other through the special language we know. And it's really no different from what any parent of teenagers has known for years, well before the internet existed, right? Which is every new generation seems to have a desire to create their own language, to grab a word like swag or bling and make it have it develop new connotations again, right?
Yeah.
It's an ongoing phenomenon, but I think on a place like Reddit, it can achieve a breadth and a scope and an immediacy that was very difficult to do before digital technologies.
Yeah, I think that is the most fascinating thing about just the speed in which all of these things are happening now, and just the problem of keeping up with all of them. I mean, we're talking about GameStop here on February 18th, and it takes time to, kind of digest a big issue like this and think about it and try and put it into some kind of context for us to understand, because all of this is so new.
Well,
So
let me add to that, just to reel back to something you said before. I think what you just said is exactly right, and it's part of the reason why long form social science, if we can call it that, qualitative social science, doesn't necessarily show up in the media in proportion to the value of insight it gives, right? Because it takes time, and it takes a long time it takes a long form to write it effectively. You need a lot of that description. A lot of it becomes very sort of nuanced descriptions and illuminations of complex phenomenon, and that doesn't necessarily play as well for a 24-hour news cycle.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, thank you again for sitting down with us, Thomas, to discuss this really fascinating topic. I hope to talk to you again about other interesting things that come up.
Looking forward to it, Pete.
All right. Well, that is all for this episode of Ask Professor. For more videos and information about our program, please follow us on social media or visit us at www.uwm.edu/anthropology. So goodbye, Thomas. Thank you again, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Pete.